Today, we're going to hear the story of No Way Back, a detective's final case. Daniel Dan Carter leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath as he stared at the old fading badge sitting on his desk. 10 years in homicide. 10 years of chasing shadows, unraveling lies, and watching criminals walk free despite overwhelming evidence. He had given everything to the force, his time, his health, his belief in justice. And in the end, he left because of one simple truth. The truth didn't always win. Now, he lived a quieter life as a private security consultant. No more late-night stakeouts. No more gut-wrenching crime scenes. Just high-paying corporate clients who wanted their buildings impenetrable and their secrets untouchable. Tonight, however, his old life came knocking. His former colleagues, detectives Ryan Holloway and Mark Davidson, sat across from him, laughing over beers. "You won't believe this tech we got our hands on," Holloway said, pulling out a tiny device no larger than a shirt button. Micro cameras. Practically invisible. High definition, real-time streaming. Thought you'd appreciate a demonstration. Dan arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. Surveillance tech's been around for ages. Not like this. Davidson grinned. These little guys pick up audio from across the room. Perfect for tight spaces, and the battery life? Insane. Come on, humor us. Set a few up around your place, see if they live up to the hype. Dan rolled his eyes but played along, placing a few in his living room, kitchen, and hallway. He saw no real use for them in his life. His job didn't require this level of espionage. He had no idea his entire world was about to shatter. The next morning, Dan drove out of the city to visit his parents. They lived in a quiet town surrounded by open fields, a stark contrast to the chaos he used to navigate. His father, retired from the construction business, spent his days tending to the backyard, while his mother still baked like she was feeding an army. "Daniel, you're too thin," she scolded, placing a plate of fresh cookies in front of him. "You work too much." Dan smiled, indulging in the familiar warmth of home. His parents had been together for nearly 40 years, a lifetime built on trust, loyalty, and love, everything he thought he had with Lauren. He stayed for dinner, enjoying their stories of the past, then made the long drive home. When he entered his house, the silence felt different. Too thick, too heavy. He poured himself a drink and sat at his desk, opening his laptop. Might as well check the camera footage. He clicked play, and everything fell apart. The screen showed his wife, Lauren, walking into their home earlier that evening. But she wasn't alone. A man, no older than 25, followed behind her, laughing, holding a bottle of wine. Dan watched as they settled onto the couch, drinking, whispering, touching. His jaw clenched, fingers tightening around his glass. The video didn't capture what happened next. His bedroom had no cameras, but it didn't need to. The moment Lauren led the younger man down the hall, giggling like a woman in love, Dan knew. Knew what she was doing. Knew what she had done. He sat there, numb, staring at the screen long after the video ended. The ice in his whiskey had melted. His pulse, however, remained slow, controlled. The rage didn't explode. It simmered, cold, calculated. Then he reached for his phone. Alex Carter picked up on the second ring. "Dan, what's up? I need you to come over." Something in his voice made Alex sober up instantly. "On my way." Within 20 minutes, his best friend arrived, stepping into the house with a cautious expression. Dan didn't say a word, just turned the laptop toward him and hit play. Silence stretched between them as Alex watched. When the footage ended, Alex exhaled. Shit. Dan poured another drink, taking a slow sip. "You know what's funny?" His voice was eerily calm. "I spent a decade catching people who thought they could get away with anything. People who believed they were untouchable. And now, it's happening to me. In my own damn house." Alex leaned back, studying his friend. "So, what's the plan, detective?" Dan's lips curled into a cold smirk. "Oh, we're going to solve this case," he said, voice dripping with quiet malice. "And this time, justice won't be blind." Dan wasn't going to simply expose Laurent's affair. He was going to dissect it. Every call, every text, every meeting. He would know her schedule better than she did. And when the time was right, he'd make his move. For the next couple of days, Dan played along like nothing had happened. He still kissed Laurent goodbye in the mornings, still asked about her day, still smiled when she laughed at some dumb show on Netflix. But behind that smile, he was watching, listening. The cameras turned out to be better than he expected. Crystal clear footage, sharp audio, and most importantly, Laurent had no clue they were there. He tested them a bit, checking angles, sound levels, seeing if they caught everything. A couple of times, he even waved at them, half smirking at his own reflection on the laptop screen. This was just a test run, he told himself. He wanted to see how well they worked. Then, on the third night, his patience paid off. Dan had stepped out for a late run just to clear his head. When he got back, the house was quiet. Lights off. Looked normal. But when he checked the footage, there she was. Laurent, thinking she was alone, pacing in the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. "Yeah, no, he doesn't suspect a thing," she said, laughing softly. "He's been so busy with work, he barely notices when I come and go." Dan clenched his jaw. "Tomorrow?" she continued, voice low. I can't. He's home all day. But maybe Friday? Same place?" A pause, then she giggled. "I can't wait either." Dan exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't stupid. He already knew. But hearing it hit different. She had no guilt in her voice, no hesitation, just excitement. Dan shut the laptop, rolling his shoulders like a boxer before a fight. All right, game on. Dan wasn't the type to act on impulse. He never had been. That's what made him a damn good detective. He let people dig their own graves before making a move. And Laurent? She was already holding the shovel. Step one was easy. Gather more evidence. Now that he knew her schedule, he started tracking her. Nothing too obvious, just checking the cameras when he wasn't home, looking at phone records, watching her body language. She was getting bolder. Coming home late, smelling like cologne that wasn't his, telling little lies that didn't even make sense. And the guy? Dan finally caught him on camera when Laurent snuck him inside again. Young, cocky, probably thought he was untouchable. Dan smirked. Poor kid had no idea whose wife he was screwing. Dan spent the next week gathering everything he needed. Laurent had no idea he was onto her. She kept sneaking around, texting that guy when she thought Dan wasn't looking, disappearing for hours with excuses that barely made sense. He didn't confront her, didn't even act suspicious. He just watched. By now, he had enough footage to prove everything. Her sneaking that punk into the house, whispering over the phone, lying through her teeth. But Dan wasn't interested in just knowing. He wanted her to feel it. The slow, creeping fear of being exposed. So he started playing mind games. The first move was subtle. Dan, accidentally, left his phone on the kitchen counter while he stepped into the shower. When he came back, he saw Laurent had unlocked it. Not unusual. She always knew his password. But this time, he had left a tab open. An article about cheating spouses and the signs to look for. She locked the phone and acted normal. But Dan caught the way her fingers tapped against the table a little too fast. How she didn't meet his eyes when she asked, "Everything okay at work?" Good. The next day, he moved things around in the house. Nothing major, just enough to make her second-guess herself. She left her perfume bottle in the bathroom. He put it on the living room shelf. Her favorite earrings on the nightstand. He tossed them in the kitchen drawer. When she noticed, she frowned, rubbing her temples. "Did you move my stuff?" Dan just shrugged. I thought that's where you left it." She laughed it off. But by the third time it happened, she was checking her phone like she expected some kind of warning message. Then came the big one. One night, after she left to grab drinks with a friend, read, meet her boy toy, Dan took his time. He logged into their shared Netflix account and watched a documentary about men who catch their cheating wives. He made sure to leave it halfway through so it showed up in the continue watching section. Then he went to bed. The next morning, Lauren turned on the TV and froze. Dan sipped his coffee, pretending not to notice the way she stared at the screen. Then casually he said, "Oh yeah, that one looked interesting. You ever heard of it?" Lauren licked her lips. No. She didn't finish her breakfast. Step 3 was the real fun part. Dan knew Lauren wasn't just cheating, she was comfortable. She thought she was in control, that she could juggle 2 lives without consequence. So he decided to take that control away. He called her parents, invited them over for dinner. "Oh, and tell your brother to come too," he added. "It's been a while." Lauren smiled, completely unaware. "That sounds great, babe." She didn't know that Dan had also invited someone else, her little boyfriend. See, Dan had done his homework. The kid, Jason, worked at a local gym. It only took a couple of fake accounts and some casual online snooping to figure out he was dumb as hell. So dumb, in fact, that when Dan texted him from a burner phone pretending to be Lauren, saying, "Come over tonight. I have a surprise for you. 7 p.m. He actually showed up. 7 p.m. The house was full. Lauren's parents, her brother, even her best friend sat around the dinner table, laughing and chatting. Dan poured wine, kept the conversation light. Lauren looked relaxed. She had no idea. Then the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Dan said. When he opened the door, Jason stood there, grinning like an idiot. "Hey, babe." Then he looked up, saw Dan, and his face went white. Dan smirked. "Come on in, kid. We're just getting started." Jason didn't move. He looked like he was trying to process just how badly he'd screwed up. Dan turned back toward the table. "Hey, Lauren. Your friend's here." Silence. Then Lauren stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "What?" she whispered. Dan stepped aside, letting Jason shuffle inside. The room went dead silent. Lauren's mother frowned. "Who's this?" Dan clapped Jason on the shoulder. "Oh, this? This is Jason. You know, the guy who's been screwing your daughter for the past few months." Gasps. Jason froze. Lauren froze. Her father's face turned red. "What?" Lauren stammered. Dan threw the remote onto the table. The screen lit up, playing one of the security recordings. The one where Lauren was laughing into her phone, telling Jason she was coming over. The footage was clear as day. Lauren turned to stone. Dan leaned in, voice low, dangerous. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Lauren's father looked like he was about to have a stroke. Her mother covered her mouth, horrified. Jason, gone. The second the video started, he bolted. Dan watched Lauren's world collapse in real time. She turned to him, eyes wide, panicked. "Dan, please, we can talk about..." Dan laughed. Actually laughed. "Nah," he said, stepping back. "We're done here." Then he grabbed his keys and walked out the door. Lauren's sobs followed him all the way to his car. Dan didn't look back. As he pulled out of the driveway, he could still hear the chaos behind him. Lauren's mother crying, her father yelling, her brother cursing under his breath. And Lauren? She was screaming his name, begging him to come back. He didn't. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath and turned up the radio. Step 3? Complete. Now, onto step 4. Lauren had assumed she'd walk away from this with a fat divorce settlement. She'd get the house, half the savings, maybe even alimony. After all, she had been with Dan for years, and they lived a pretty damn comfortable life. But what she didn't know was that Dan had spent the last month preparing for this moment. First, he moved most of their savings into an account under his name only, nothing illegal, just smart. It was money he had earned before the marriage, and he made sure it was protected. Then, he visited a divorce lawyer. A damn good one. Adultery, the lawyer had said, raising an eyebrow. And you have video proof? Dan nodded. The lawyer smirked. She's screwed. Lauren wasn't just losing the house, she was losing everything. 2 days after the dinner disaster, Dan's phone rang. Lauren. He let it go to voicemail. Then she called again. And again. And again. Finally, he answered. Her voice was a wreck. Dan, please, can we just talk? Dan leaned back in his chair, sipping a beer. Talk about what? She choked on her words. I made a mistake, okay? A huge mistake. But we can fix this. I still love you. Dan chuckled. You love me? Yes, she practically sobbed. You know I do. Funny, he said. You didn't sound so in love when you were in my house with him. Silence. Then, quietly. Dan, please. I have nowhere to go. And there it was. This wasn't about love. This was about survival. Dan's voice turned cold. Not my problem. Then he hung up. Lauren was done. Her family wanted nothing to do with her. The divorce papers were already on the way. The house? Gone. The money? Gone. But there was one loose end left. Jason. See, Dan hadn't just been watching Lauren, he had been watching him too. And Jason? He was hiding something. Dan had checked his background. No major red flags, just a dumb gym bro with a big ego. But then Dan dug deeper. Turns out, Jason had another girlfriend. And guess what? She had no idea about Lauren. So Dan did what he did best. He let the truth come out. A few screenshots. A well-timed message to the girlfriend. And within hours, Jason's world came crashing down too. By the end of the week, Lauren was alone. No money, no family, no Jason, nothing. Dan, he slept like a baby. Dan wasn't the type to celebrate, but damn, if this didn't feel like a victory. Lauren was gone. The divorce was underway. His house was quiet, peaceful, exactly the way he liked it. But as he sat on his porch one night, beer in hand, something felt off. He wasn't used to winning. As a detective, he had spent years watching criminals walk free, watching victims get screwed over by the system. He had learned the hard way that justice wasn't guaranteed. And yet, here he was. He won. So why didn't it feel like enough? His phone buzzed. A message from Alex. Alex, drinks tonight? You deserve it. Dan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, maybe a night out would help clear his head. They met at a small dive bar downtown. The kind of place where no one asked questions and the whiskey was cheap. Alex smirked as Dan slid onto the stool beside him. You look like a man who just buried a body. Dan snorted. Close enough. They clinked glasses and drank. For the first time in weeks, Dan let himself relax. The weight on his chest, lighter. His mind, finally quiet. Then a voice cut through the bar. Well, well, if it isn't Dan Carter. Dan turned, glass halfway to his lips. A man stood in the doorway. Tall, broad shoulders, dark eyes that held too many secrets. Dan's stomach dropped. Ryan Holloway. An old name. A bad name. Alex tensed beside him. What the hell is he doing here? Dan didn't answer. Ryan smirked, stepping closer. Heard you left the force, Carter. Shame. We had unfinished business. Dan's grip tightened on his glass. He knew exactly what Ryan was talking about. And it wasn't good. Ryan Holloway wasn't just some random guy. He was the one that got away. Back when Dan was a detective, he had spent 2 years trying to put Ryan behind bars. The guy was dirty. Drugs, money laundering, and at least one dead body tied to his name. But Ryan had connections. Big ones. And every time Dan got close, the case would fall apart. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence went missing. Eventually, Dan had to let it go. But now, Ryan was standing right in front of him, grinning like the devil himself. "You look good," Ryan said, taking a sip of his drink. "Retirement suits you." Dan didn't blink. "What do you want?" Ryan leaned in. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough." Then he walked out. Dan's blood ran cold. This wasn't over. Not even close. Dan sat in silence, staring at the empty doorway where Ryan Holloway had just been. The bastard had walked in like he owned the place, like the past didn't matter. But it did. It always did. Alex leaned in, his voice low. "Tell me you're not thinking about going after him." Dan didn't answer. He just took another slow sip of whiskey, rolling the glass between his fingers. Alex exhaled. "Come on, man. You're out. You got your revenge. You cleaned up your life. Don't do this." Dan finally met his gaze. "I didn't start this." Alex cursed under his breath. "And you think you're gonna finish it?" Dan set his glass down, his expression unreadable. "If I don't, who will?" By the time Dan got home, it was past midnight. His house was dark, quiet, just how he liked it. But as he stepped inside, his instincts kicked in. Something was off. His keys clinked against the table as he scanned the room. Everything looked the same, but he'd spent years noticing the small details. Then he saw it. A single white envelope sitting on his kitchen counter. He didn't leave it there. His muscles tensed as he picked it up, carefully tearing it open. Inside, there was a photo. A grainy, zoomed-in shot of him and Alex at the bar. On the back, a message. "Still watching, Carter? Let's play." Dan's jaw clenched. His fingers tightened around the paper. Ryan had been waiting for this. And now, the game had begun. Dan stood in his kitchen, gripping the photo so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ryan wasn't just watching. He was taunting him. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a challenge. Dan exhaled slowly, setting the picture down. His heartbeat had steadied. His mind had already started working. Ryan wanted a game? Fine. But Dan was going to play by his own rules. First, he checked the locks, then the windows. Everything was secure. But that didn't mean Ryan hadn't been inside. Dan pulled out his phone and checked the micro cameras, the same ones that had exposed Loran. He had left a few running, just out of habit. He scrolled through the footage. And there he was. Ryan. Inside Dan's house. The footage showed him standing in the living room, looking around like he owned the place. He had been alone, unarmed, smiling. That pissed Dan off more than anything. Ryan wasn't afraid. He was confident. Too confident. Dan leaned back against the counter, watching the screen. His mind worked fast, piecing things together. Ryan didn't break in to hurt him. Not yet. This was about control. About getting inside Dan's head. But Dan wasn't the same man Ryan used to know. If Ryan thought he had the upper hand, he was dead wrong. Dan grabbed his phone and dialed. Alex picked up on the first ring. "Tell me you're not about to do something stupid." Dan's voice was calm. "Not stupid, just necessary." A pause. Then a sigh. "All right. What's the plan?" Dan looked back at the footage, watching Ryan smirk at the camera. "We set a trap." The next morning, Dan took a drive. Not to the bar. Not to Alex's. But to an old contact. A guy who used to work with the force but didn't exactly play by the rules. The kind of guy who could find things the cops couldn't. His name was Ray Mercer. Ray ran a small security business, officially. Unofficially? He was the guy you called when you needed dirt on someone. Dan parked outside the shop, got out, and walked in. Ray was behind the counter, sipping coffee, his boots kicked up on the desk. He glanced up, saw Dan, and smirked. Well, well, if it ain't Carter. Thought you were done with this life. Dan leaned on the counter. Not quite. Ray sat up, setting his coffee down. What do you need? Dan slid the photo across the desk. Him. Ray studied it for a second, then whistled. Ryan Holloway. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. Dan crossed his arms. I need everything. His movements, his contacts, where he sleeps at night. Ray raised an eyebrow. Planning to handle this legally? Dan didn't answer. Ray chuckled. Didn't think so. He leaned back, rubbing his chin. All right, give me a couple of days? Dan nodded. Make it fast. As he turned to leave, Ray called after him. Hey, Carter. Dan glanced back. Ray smirked. Be careful. You're not a cop anymore. Dan held his gaze. Neither is he. And then he walked out. Dan spent the rest of the day preparing. He checked his cameras, repositioned a few, picked up a burner phone. Then he waited. It wasn't a question of if Ryan would show up again. It was when. And when he did, Dan would be ready. The waiting was always the worst part. Dan sat in his darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in one hand, his eyes locked on the monitor displaying the live feed from his hidden cameras. He had adjusted them after Ryan's last visit. Wider angles, better positioning. If Ryan tried to come back, he wouldn't just get caught. He'd be trapped. The clock ticked past 2 a.m. The streets were quiet. Even the city felt like it was holding its breath. Then, movement. Dan's eyes sharpened. A figure at the edge of the yard. Slow. Careful. Staying in the shadows. Ryan, number 2 small. Wrong posture. Dan sat up, his fingers tightening around his glass. The figure crept closer, moving toward the back fence. They hesitated, then crouched near the gate's lock. A break-in. But not Ryan. Dan moved. Silent. Smooth. Years of training kicking in. He set the glass down, grabbed his gun, and made his way to the back door. By the time he reached it, the intruder had the gate halfway open. Dan flipped the porch light on. Wrong house. The figure froze. Then bolted. Dan was faster. He was through the door in seconds, chasing them down the driveway. The kid, because up close, that's what he was, just a kid, tried to hop the fence. Dan grabbed him by the collar and yanked him back. The kid hit the ground hard, gasping. Jesus, man! Dan pressed the barrel of his gun against the kid's forehead. Who sent you? The kid's eyes went wide. Whoa, what? Dan didn't blink. Who? Sent. You? I don't know what you're talking about, man, I swear. I was just looking for an easy score. Dan studied him. Shaky hands. Thin frame. Probably a junkie. Not Ryan's style. After a moment, Dan pulled the gun back. Get out of here. The kid scrambled to his feet and ran. Dan watched him disappear into the night, his mind racing. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't feel like one. This wasn't just some random break-in. Ryan was pushing him, testing him. And Dan had just failed the first test. By the time morning came, Dan had made a decision. Waiting wouldn't work. Ryan wanted to play games? Fine. Dan was going to flip the board. He grabbed his burner phone and dialed Alex. The line picked up. Tell me you didn't kill anyone last night. Dan ignored him. Meet me at Ray's. A pause. Then a sigh. This is going to get messy, isn't it? Dan's voice was cold. It already is. Ray Mercer's office smelled like stale coffee and bad decisions. When Dan and Alex walked in, Ray was already at his desk, flipping through a file. Carter. He nodded at Alex. Other Carter. Alex rolled his eyes. Not my name. Ray grinned and tossed the file onto the table. You wanted dirt on Ryan? Well, I got plenty. Dan picked up the folder and flipped it open. Inside, Photos, addresses, names. Ryan had been busy. Drug deals, extortion, a new crew. But the last page was what made Dan pause. A picture of a woman. Dark hair, sharp eyes. Standing next to Ryan, a cigarette in one hand, a gun in the other. Alex leaned in. Who's she? Ray smirked. That's Valerie Cross, Ryan's new second-in-command. Dan's jaw tightened. He knew that name. He knew her. Alex frowned. Dude, you good? Dan exhaled slowly. Valerie Cross wasn't just some criminal. She was Dan's ex-partner. And she used to be a cop. Dan stared at the photo of Valerie Cross, his grip tightening on the page. He hadn't seen her in years. Back when he was still a detective, Valerie had been one of the best. Sharp, fearless, loyal. At least, that's what he'd thought. Until she disappeared right before a major corruption case blew up in their department. No goodbye, no warning. Just gone. And now she was working with Ryan Holloway. Alex raised an eyebrow. You want to tell me why you look like you just saw a ghost? Dan exhaled, setting the file down. She used to be my partner. Ray let out a low whistle. Damn, that's messy. Alex frowned. She dirty? Dan hesitated. She wasn't when I knew her. But if she's with Ryan now... He shook his head. She's either changed or she was never who I thought she was. Ray leaned back in his chair. She's dangerous, Carter. Word is, she's just as smart as you. Maybe smarter. Dan scoffed. We'll see about that. Alex crossed his arms. All right, so what's the move? We go after Ryan? Or do we go after her? Dan didn't even have to think about it. We go after both. Dan knew how Ryan worked. He liked control. He liked being one step ahead. Which meant the best way to get to him was to take something away. Valerie. Dan spent the next 2 days tracking her movements, using Ray's intel and his own experience. She was careful, smart. She never took the same route twice, never stayed in one place too long. But everyone had patterns, and on the 3rd day, Dan found hers. A bar downtown. Quiet, off the radar. She went there late, usually alone. A place where she felt safe. Dan parked across the street that night, watching. At 11:27 p.m., Valerie walked in. Alone. Dan's heart pounded in his chest, but his face stayed cold. He waited a few minutes, then got out of the car and followed her inside. The bar was dimly lit, half empty. A low hum of conversation filled the space, but Dan only focused on one person. Valerie sat at the counter, nursing a whiskey. Dan walked up beside her, casual, controlled. Didn't think whiskey was your thing. She stiffened. Slowly, she turned to face him. For a moment, there was just silence. Then she smirked. Well, shit, if it isn't Danny Carter. Dan didn't react. It's been a while. She took a sip of her drink. Couple of years. More like 5. Valerie chuckled. Didn't think you'd be keeping track. Dan leaned on the bar. Didn't think you'd end up working with scumbags like Ryan Holloway. Her smirk faded. You don't know a damn thing about what I've been up to. Dan tilted his head. So tell me. She studied him for a moment, then shook her head. You're wasting your time. Dan's voice lowered. Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to see if the Valerie Cross I knew is still in there. Something flickered in her eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. She set her glass down and stood. Walk away, Dan. Dan didn't move. Can't do that. Valerie sighed. Then you're in over your head. She turned to leave. Dan grabbed her wrist. Not hard, just enough to make a point. She froze. Then, slowly, she looked down at his hand, then back up at him. And for the first time that night, her smirk turned into something else. A warning. Let go. Dan held her gaze for a second longer, then released her. She took a step back. Last chance, Carter. Drop this. Walk away. Dan's voice was calm. You know I won't. Valerie exhaled. Then I guess I'll see you soon. She turned and walked out of the bar. Dan watched her go, his mind racing. She was lying. She didn't want to see him soon. She was going to tell Ryan. Dan had just made his move. Now it was their turn. Dan didn't go home. He knew Valerie. The moment she walked out of that bar, she'd call Ryan. And Ryan? He'd retaliate. Dan wasn't going to sit around waiting. Instead, he drove straight to Alex's place. The second Alex opened the door, Dan pushed past him. We don't have time. Alex blinked. Nice to see you too. Dan grabbed a duffel bag from the corner, his old gear, bulletproof vest, gloves, a backup piece. Alex's expression darkened. This is happening now? Dan zipped up the bag. It's happening tonight. Dan and Alex set up at an abandoned warehouse near the docks, Ryan's main operation. It was a high-risk move, but that was the point. They weren't here to sneak in. They were here to burn everything down. Alex knelt beside Dan, checking his rifle. You sure about this? Dan's gaze was locked on the entrance. Yeah. Alex exhaled. All right then. Let's do some damage. Part 31. Fire and blood. 2:14 a.m. The first explosion rocked the docks. Ryan's men came pouring out of the warehouse, weapons drawn. Dan and Alex took their positions. Silencers on. 1 shot. 2. Men dropped. Panic spread through the ranks. Ryan's crew wasn't trained for this. They were thugs, not soldiers. Dan moved fast, clearing the back entrance while Alex provided cover fire. Inside, crates of cash, drugs, and weapons lined the walls. Dan pulled out a lighter and dropped it. The fire spread instantly. He stepped back as the flames roared, swallowing everything in their path. Ryan was about to lose everything. Part 32. Showdown. Ryan arrived just as the warehouse went up in flames. He was breathing hard, eyes wild with rage. Behind him? Valerie. Her gun was already aimed at Dan. Ryan stepped forward, fists clenched. You really think this makes you the winner? Dan's expression was cold. Number but it makes you the loser. Ryan lunged. Dan moved first. A single punch. Hard, precise. Ryan stumbled back, dazed. Dan grabbed him by the collar. This is for everything. 1. A strike to the ribs. 2. A knee to the gut. Ryan gasped, blood spilling from his mouth. Dan threw him to the ground. Valerie didn't move. Her gun was still raised, but her finger wasn't on the trigger. Dan looked at her. You gonna do it? She hesitated. Then she lowered the gun. Ryan coughed, trying to push himself up. You think you're better than me? Dan stared down at him. I don't have to be. I just have to be the one who walks away. And then, bang, a single shot. Ryan collapsed. Dan turned. Valerie was still holding the gun. Her face was unreadable. Dan exhaled. So that's how it ends? She shrugged. It was always gonna end like this. A long silence. Then she tossed the gun aside. See you around, Carter. She walked into the night. Dan didn't stop her. Because some ghosts? The sun was rising when Dan pulled into his driveway. His house was empty. Lauren was gone. Everything was gone, just like he planned. On the table, divorce papers, signed. A single note beside them. You win. Dan sat down, staring at the empty glass in front of him. The war was over, and for the first time in a long time, Dan Carter was free.